He called her a naive little girl in front of the entire Supreme Court. He rolled his eyes, mocked her credentials, and dismissed everything she stood for. But what Chief Justice John Roberts didn't know was that Karoline Leavitt came prepared, with one piece of evidence that would shatter his polished reputation and shake the highest court in America. What happened next stunned every justice in the room, left the audience frozen, and made the nation ask, is even the Chief Justice above the law? This is where everything changed. If you like storytelling like this, make sure to subscribe. Let's get into it. The Supreme Court building stood like a fortress of marble and silence in the early morning haze, an institution cloaked in reverence, above politics, above chaos. Or so the public was meant to believe. But on this day, behind those stone columns, something was about to rupture. Inside the court, an emergency session had been called. The topic, a class action lawsuit challenging the government's backdoor influence over social media censorship. Names like X, Meta, and Truth Social were in the briefs. And so was a pattern, one that linked federal agencies to speech suppression and, chillingly, to a few black-robed individuals sitting behind the Supreme Court bench. Most people weren't supposed to know that. Karoline Leavitt sat quietly in the first row of benches, her eyes fixed forward, documents clutched tightly in her hands. At just 26, she'd already faced down press mobs, political hit jobs, and White House briefings under fire. But this was different. She was stepping into the highest courtroom in America, where the stakes weren't just reputational, they were constitutional. As her name was announced, asterisk, Ms. Karoline Leavitt, press secretary and special witness for the plaintiffs. Asterisk, a few heads turned. A murmur ran through the elite legal crowd. Then, the gavel struck. Chief Justice John Roberts leaned forward from his elevated position, voice cold and heavy with authority. Miss Leavitt, he said, not even trying to hide the edge in his tone. This court is not a place for grandstanding or internet theatrics. If you intend to speak, keep your commentary concise and your tone civil. Karoline didn't flinch, but others did. The room, already silent, grew somehow heavier. Roberts wasn't finished. Let's be clear. You're not a legal scholar. You're not a constitutional expert. This is not a press briefing. This is the United States Supreme Court. Govern yourself accordingly, young lady. The phrase young lady dropped with an audible sneer, like a dagger wrapped in velvet. Some of the older justices didn't react. A few, notably Justice Barrett, visibly shifted in discomfort. But Roberts sat back with a satisfied look, as if he'd already won whatever unspoken battle had begun. Karoline stood, took one breath, and raised her chin slightly. Understood, Your Honor, she replied, calm and steady. I came here to speak the truth, and I'll do so with the respect this court deserves, even if that respect is not returned. That did it. The temperature in the chamber changed, sharp as glass. Roberts narrowed his eyes, jaw tightening. It wasn't just her words. It was the way she delivered them. Calm, unshaken, unapologetic. He didn't like it. He didn't like her. Because Karoline Leavitt wasn't the kind of woman this court usually welcomed. She wasn't Ivy League. She wasn't molded by the D.C. Circuit. She wasn't deferential. She was blunt, conservative, and fiercely unafraid to say things others only whispered. And now she stood just 20 feet from the most powerful judge in America, holding files labeled confidential in bold red ink. Outside, protesters waved signs demanding transparency. Inside, one woman had come prepared to expose what the bench never expected to see under a courtroom spotlight: their own fingerprints on a system built to suppress the very voices they swore to protect. As Karoline approached the witness podium, Roberts leaned toward his microphone, voice low but sharp. I'll remind you again, Ms. Leavitt, this is not a theater. We are here to interpret law, not entertain conspiracy. She didn't miss a beat. Then I trust the truth will be welcome, Your Honor, she said, placing the thick folder on the stand with an audible thud. Because everything in this file is backed by dates, bank records, emails, and recordings. And all of it traces back to this court. The chamber went still. One justice shifted in her seat. Another furrowed his brow. Robert's fingers tightened around the gavel. "You may proceed," he said, voice strained now, each word measured. Karoline opened the folder. She had walked into the lion's den, but now the lions were starting to realize she brought fire. The Supreme Court chamber was carved from history itself. Polished mahogany, towering marble columns, gold accents reflecting authority older than most nations. The room radiated power, quiet and unyielding. But today, that silence carried tension. Not the sacred calm of reasoned debate, but the oppressive stillness before something cracks. The hearing was supposed to be procedural. A closed-door review of allegations that federal agencies had pressured social media platforms to censor specific viewpoints, especially those critical of government COVID policies, foreign policy, and conservative causes. But word had leaked. The public knew this wasn't just about tech companies. It was about whether America still had a First Amendment. And some suspected it might be about whether the court itself was compromised. Chief Justice John Roberts sat centered on the bench, perfectly composed. He looked like a portrait brought to life. Silver hair parted precisely, robe draped without a wrinkle, expression unreadable. But behind his eyes was something colder than neutrality. Control. To his left sat Justice Sonia Sotomayor, lips pressed into a thin line. To his right, Justice Barrett looked down at her notes, the faintest flicker of discomfort in her eyes. Roberts scanned the chamber. His gaze briefly landed on Karoline Leavitt, who stood at the ready, documents in hand, posture straight, presence unmistakable. He didn't like her, not just because she was outspoken, not because she was conservative, but because she didn't shrink. And women who didn't shrink? They irritated him more than he cared to admit. From the start, Roberts had tried to shape this hearing, narrow its scope, limit witnesses, control the language in the briefings. Words like government collusion were replaced with institutional cooperation. Censorship became content moderation alignment. It was all sanitized, neutered. But Karoline's presence complicated that. She wasn't an attorney, and that infuriated him. She wasn't bound by legalese or fear of disbarment. She had nothing to lose, and worse, receipts. Still, Roberts had the room, and he reminded everyone of that with a slow, deliberate motion, adjusting his microphone before speaking, voice calm, clipped, and absolute. "This court recognizes Miss Karoline Leavitt for supplemental testimony," he said, eyes never leaving her. "Let the record reflect that she is a political appointee, not a member of the bar, and her comments shall be treated as informational, not authoritative." He didn't say it, but everyone heard it. "She's just a girl." Karoline stepped forward, her heels sharp against the polished floor, a folder tucked under one arm, her expression unreadable. But inside that folder were the reasons Roberts hadn't slept soundly in weeks. Outside, crowds pressed against the barriers. Reporters from every major outlet were huddled near the steps, cameras ready, live streams rolling. Inside, a few carefully placed observers, trusted staff, favored press contacts, took notes. All of them understood that what happened today might never be officially published, but it would shape the next decade. Karoline stopped at the podium. She didn't speak right away. She looked up, directly at the 9 justices, and then at Roberts. "With respect," she said finally, her voice measured but clear, "I understand this court sees me as an outsider, perhaps even as an irritant. But I'm not here for comfort. I'm here because the people who elected this government believe their voices were stolen, not by private companies, but by public power hidden behind private doors." Justice Kavanaugh raised an eyebrow. Gorsuch leaned forward slightly. Robert stayed perfectly still. "Miss Leavitt," he said flatly, "this court will not entertain populist provocations. Stick to what is material. Otherwise, you may find yourself dismissed." Karoline didn't blink. "Then let me begin with this," she said, sliding a USB drive onto the clerk's table. "It contains audio recordings from a federal whistleblower. They outline conversations between White House staff and platform executives. Those calls, some of which were later traced to judicial aides, preceded key rulings on speech cases." A murmur broke through the back of the chamber. One clerk looked up wide-eyed. Roberts didn't flinch. but his jaw shifted ever so slightly. "Unverified evidence carries no weight here," he said coldly. "You may submit it for review, but this court will not entertain fiction, especially from non-experts." That pause, especially from non-experts, dripped with the same tone as young lady. Karoline leaned in slightly, locking eyes with him. "That's fine," she said, "because some truths don't need credentials. They just need daylight." Roberts sat back slowly, as if weighing whether to push harder or prepare for what was coming. Because something was coming, and he knew it. Karoline stood firm behind the podium, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the wood, but her presence was unmistakable. Not defiant, not disrespectful, just resolute. And that made Chief Justice John Roberts grind his teeth behind his carefully composed smile. He wasn't used to this kind of presence from someone like her. Not in this room. Not from a woman barely in her 20s, without a law degree, without permission from the system he had spent decades building. To Roberts, this chamber was sacred, his domain, his control. But in that moment, he was already losing grip of it. He leaned forward slightly, his voice even colder than before. "Ms. Leavitt, I'll remind you one more time. You are not a party to this case, nor are you here as legal counsel. Your testimony is a courtesy, not a right. Abuse it, and I will revoke that courtesy." Karoline didn't even blink. "Understood, Your Honor," she replied, eyes locked on his. "But I would argue the Constitution gives every citizen the right to speak when justice is under threat. Isn't that what we're here to protect?" That line struck something deeper than anyone expected. Justice Thomas raised his eyebrows slightly. Alito tapped his pen. A whisper of tension moved through the chamber. Not loud, not overt, but felt. Roberts's robe shifted as he leaned back, fingers tapping the armrest once, twice faster. He hated this, because Karoline wasn't being emotional. She wasn't ranting or grandstanding. He could have dismissed her then. No, she was doing something worse. She was being surgical, and every word she spoke chipped away at the wall of authority he'd built around himself. "Let's be clear," Roberts said slowly, voice dripping with condescension. "You are not on trial here. Your opinions may resonate on social media, Miss Leavitt, but this court functions on precedent, not on populist outrage." Karoline nodded, as if granting him a small win. Then she pulled a single sheet from her folder and held it up. "Then let's talk precedent," she said. "Here's a memo from the Department of Homeland Security, dated October 2021, referencing a coordination call with Facebook's Trusted Flaggers group. The memo specifically mentions anticipating judicial alignment following guidance from what it calls, quote, sympathetic chambers." The courtroom shifted. Justice Barrett leaned forward. Justice Kagan tilted her head. Roberts didn't move, but something in his jawline turned rigid. "You're implying," Roberts said slowly, "that this court is taking cues from federal agencies based on political motive? That's a serious accusation." Karoline didn't hesitate. "I'm not implying anything," she replied coolly. "I'm reading directly from their own documents. Would you like to see the next page?" Roberts narrowed his eyes. "I would prefer," he said icily, "that you remember your place in this chamber." There it was. Not just the dismissiveness, the threat beneath it, the suggestion that she was overstepping, not because of what she was saying, but because of who she was. A woman. Young. Conservative. Outsider. Karoline stepped forward by half an inch, subtle, but enough. Her voice sharpened just slightly. "My place, Chief Justice, is to ensure that those who operate behind black robes and marble walls aren't immune to the truth. I didn't come here to accuse. I came here to reveal." Roberts slammed the gavel. Crack. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the chamber. "One more insinuation like that, and I will have you removed." Karoline's expression didn't change. "Then you'll have to remove me for reading the truth into the record." She held up a second document. This one with bold red markings. Confidential communication. Supreme Court Liaison. Civic Trust. A ripple moved through the audience section. One young staffer gasped quietly. One of the justices, Justice Gorsuch, visibly furrowed his brow. Roberts shifted. The name Civic Trust had not been mentioned in public before. Not in this context. "You are playing with fire," he said, quieter now, but more threatening. Karoline looked at him, calm, steady. "Then I suggest you read these before the flames get higher." And with that, she placed the document on the podium. For the first time all morning, Roberts didn't speak, and that silence said more than anything else. The moment Karoline set the Civic Trust document on the podium, the courtroom began to shift. Not in volume, not in action, but in temperature. The once impervious wall of formality began to splinter. Chief Justice Roberts didn't move. Not yet, but his fingers curled around the edge of the bench, knuckles whitening. He stared at the sheet like it was a snake poised to strike. Karoline took her time, carefully unfolding the next document from her folder. A crisp black and white printout. Financial records. She held it up deliberately. "This," she said, voice measured, "is a wire transfer receipt dated April 14th, 2023. $125,000 moved from a Shell account registered under Civic Trust Holdings to a law clerk with direct access to chambers within this building." The silence in the courtroom turned to stillness, like someone had sucked the oxygen from the air. Justice Sotomayor narrowed her eyes. Barrett shifted in her seat. The court reporter paused, then resumed typing with more urgency. Roberts finally spoke. "That's hearsay, Miss Leavitt," he said, his voice low and cold. "And slanderous, if repeated outside these walls." Karoline locked eyes with him. "Then I suggest someone open an investigation to confirm or deny it," she said. "Because the money didn't stop there. Civic Trust donated over $2 million to entities directly connected to legal scholarship, judicial travel, and nonprofit advocacy groups, all of which were cited in opinions authored by this court." A whisper rippled across the gallery. Even Roberts couldn't stop it. "This is a courtroom, not a Fox News segment," he snapped. "And you're the Chief Justice," she countered, her voice rising just enough to cut the room. "So why are you afraid of receipts?" The gavel slammed. Crack. "Miss Leavitt, you will restrain yourself. You've restrained free speech long enough. Your Honor," she said sharply. The words hit like a slap. Gasps burst from the benches. A staffer in the back dropped a notepad. One of the press liaisons typed furiously on her phone, eyes wide. Roberts leaned forward, fury tightening every syllable. "You think this is justice? Throwing baseless claims into the wind and expecting this court to bow? You're not here because of your merit. You're here because your side thought bringing a fresh face would make noise." Karoline didn't back down. In fact, she stepped forward. "No, I'm here because your side thought no one would ever have the courage to confront you." She placed another file on the stand, labeled Judicial Outreach, Internal Strategy. The first page was visible, a flowchart mapping out preferred judicial influencers for advocacy opinions, with initials next to quotes from Roberts' past remarks. His eyes flickered. Briefly, "This is nonsense," he growled. "Then disprove it," she replied. "Explain why Civic Trust language appears word for word in a concurring opinion you signed in the Patriot Speech Initiative case. Explain why a nonprofit no one had heard of before 2020 now holds contracts with federal agencies and connections to multiple members of this very court." Roberts stood. "That broke protocol. Chief Justices don't rise mid-testimony. You are attacking the integrity of the judicial branch," he said, voice raised now, gavel still in his hand. "I will not permit this courtroom to become a circus for grandstanding." "This isn't a circus," Karoline said. "It's an autopsy. I'm cutting open what you've tried to keep buried." Roberts gritted his teeth. He looked to the bailiff, then back to her. "You are one word away from removal." Karoline lifted her chin, eyes like steel. "Then here's the word, liberty. That's what you were supposed to defend. Instead, you sold it to the highest bidder." The gavel slammed again, but it no longer commanded silence. Spectators shifted. A buzz rolled through the room. Someone near the back raised a phone, quietly hitting record. Roberts sat down slowly. His composure was cracking. Karoline flipped to one last page. "I have the names," she said, "of donors, liaisons, and clerks. I have email logs, calendar entries, travel vouchers. You want to call this a conspiracy theory? Fine, but it won't be one for long." Roberts didn't respond, because now everyone was looking at him, not as a judge, but as a man with something to hide. Karoline held the courtroom in the palm of her hand now, not by raising her voice, not with theatrics, but with something far more dangerous: facts. The kind no gavel could silence. She slid a small device onto the podium, no bigger than a car key, but capable of detonation in a room like this. "This is a recording," she said, calm and even, taken by a federal whistleblower who served as a legal researcher for a government advisory panel. "The voices you're about to hear include a Department of Justice official and a senior representative from Civic Trust. They discuss coordination with judicial figures to ensure alignment on pending censorship-related cases." Chief Justice Roberts didn't move, but the color drained slightly from his face. A crack in the marble. "Miss Leavitt," he said, low and sharp, "you were not authorized to introduce audio evidence into this record. And you weren't authorized to ignore the Constitution," she shot back. "But here we are." Without waiting for permission, she pressed play. The chamber filled with muffled but audible voices. "We've already briefed JR through the informal channel. He understands that certain rulings will need to reflect national security priorities. Civic Trust will coordinate language recommendations like before. Just keep it tight. He prefers single-page summaries." A gasp. Audible. One justice, Justice Gorsuch, glanced sideways at Roberts. Karoline let it hang for a beat, then stopped the recording. "That reference to JR isn't vague," she said, lifting a document. "This is an internal Civic Trust memo, signed and time-stamped, referring to a meeting with JR on March 11th, 2023. The same day Chief Justice Roberts was scheduled for a private luncheon at the Hay Adams Hotel. I have hotel records confirming his presence." The gavel slammed down again, louder, angrier. "This is outrageous." Roberts barked. "Fabrications. The court will strike this from the record." "The public won't," Karoline snapped back, "because I just emailed every file I have to 3 media outlets. They're not going away." The room came alive. Gasps. Murmurs. One justice leaned toward another, whispering something with a hand over her mouth. The courtroom clerk paused her typing. Even a normally stoic bailiff took a half-step forward, unsure of what would happen next. Karoline wasn't done. "You called me a naive little girl. You told me to remember my place. But what you didn't count on was this." She held up another sheet, an email chain between Civic Trust Policy Director and a DOJ liaison. Subject line: Roberts notes for next week. It includes recommended phrases, legal citations, and yes, your initials in the margin. Roberts stood again. "Enough." His voice cracked with fury, too sharp, too emotional for the man who had built a career on icy restraint. The gavel slammed again, but now it rang hollow. "You will not smear this court with lies and political garbage." Karoline turned to him slowly, eyes locked. "Then deny it. On the record. Right now." He froze. "Deny that you ever received material from Civic Trust. Deny the meeting at Hay Adams. Deny that these files, this evidence, means what we all know it means." The Chief Justice's mouth opened, but no words came out. Because he couldn't. From the gallery, a reporter whispered to her colleague, "He's done." And still, Karoline wasn't finished. She placed a final page on the podium. The heading: Liberty Initiative Funding Breakdown. This spreadsheet tracks Civic Trust dispersals to various legal organizations. Included is a $75,000 payment to a nonprofit called the American Stability Forum, days before it published an amicus brief cited in a censorship ruling authored by you, Chief Justice. Roberts's eyes locked on the page. For a moment, he looked as if he didn't recognize it, or didn't want to. His breath caught, audible through the stillness. "These are coincidences," he muttered, voice stripped of its usual command. "This is a smear job. You and your political handlers. You'll regret this." Karoline tilted her head slightly, calm as ever. "No, Your Honor. I didn't fabricate anything. I'm just the one who refused to stay silent. And what you're really afraid of is that the rest of the country won't stay silent either." The room was no longer under Roberts's control. People were whispering, recording. Even some court staff exchanged glances, their eyes full of doubt and disbelief. The air felt electric, like a thunderstorm was about to break indoors. Karoline stepped back from the podium. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply looked at Roberts and said, "You told me I didn't belong in this courtroom. But after today, you'll wish I never walked in because I just exposed everything you spent years hiding." The courtroom no longer resembled a place of order. The marble walls, the grand seal, the towering columns, none of it could contain what was now happening inside. Chief Justice John Roberts stood behind the bench, robe hanging stiffly from his shoulders, hands trembling ever so slightly at his sides. He was breathing harder now. Gone was the calm commander of precedent. In his place stood a man who'd been cornered by someone he underestimated. Karoline Leavitt had taken a single step back from the podium, allowing the silence to speak. The evidence she laid out remained untouched. The audio recording, the email chain, the wire transfer logs, still sitting there like landmines waiting to explode. Roberts gripped the edge of the bench. His eyes scanned the room, searching, perhaps for a sympathetic glance, a procedural out, a loyal clerk ready to intervene. He found none. Even his own staff avoided his eyes now. Then it happened. A small voice broke the silence. "It's true." Heads turned. It was a junior clerk, barely in her 20s, seated near the court reporter. Her voice cracked with fear, but she stood anyway, clutching a thin manila folder to her chest. "He made us erase files," she said, looking toward Karoline, but loud enough for the room to hear. "On civic trust. On the Liberty Initiative. I didn't want to, but he said if I didn't, I'd never work again." Gasps erupted. One of the justices, Alito, sat up straighter, his eyes now fixed on Roberts. The Chief Justice turned, fury in his eyes. "You don't know what you're saying," he snapped, pointing at the clerk. "Sit down. Now." But she didn't. In fact, another clerk stood beside her. This one older, gray-haired, who until this moment had worn an expression of neutral loyalty. "Sir," the second clerk said, voice flat, "we can't protect this anymore." The Chief Justice's mouth opened, but nothing came out. And then, the final tremor. The doors at the back of the chamber creaked open, not loud, but somehow deafening in the moment. Two men in dark suits entered, their badges visible even from a bench. "FBI." Roberts visibly tensed. One of the agents stepped forward and addressed the room. Not the court, but the room. His voice was clear, professional, and deliberate. "We have been authorized to take into custody all relevant materials pertaining to the Civic Trust investigation. That includes audio files, financial records, and court communications." The Chief Justice stepped back from the bench. You can't just walk into this courtroom and—" "We can," the agent interrupted, "under emergency federal statute and assigned authorization from the Department of Justice." The other agent walked calmly toward the clerk's table, collecting Karoline's files. "These are part of the preliminary evidence," Karoline said, her voice calm as ever. "I've already sent digital copies. You'll find everything in sequence." Roberts looked around the chamber, now filled with suspicion. Cameras were rolling. Phones were out. The gallery was buzzing with whispers, some already uploading video clips with hashtags like #RobertsUnmasked and #SupremeLeak. "You think you've won?" he muttered, voice cracking as he stared down at Karoline. "You think this circus makes you right?" "No," Karoline said. "The truth does." Roberts clenched his fists. For a moment, he looked like he might lunge forward, his face contorted in disbelief, pride, and rage all at once. His voice dropped into a snarl. "I am a Chief Justice. This chamber belongs to me." "That's the problem," Karoline replied. "It never should have." The clerk who'd spoken up earlier stepped forward, holding the manila folder out to the agents. "There's more," she said. "Internal meeting notes." He ordered deletions himself. The lead agent took the folder and turned to Roberts. "Sir, we need to speak with you. Privately, if you prefer. Or here, if you insist." Roberts looked down at the bench, then at the agents, then at Karoline. And for the first time in his career, he said nothing. Not to protest, not to deny, not even to threaten. Just silence. Karoline stepped away from the podium and crossed her arms. Her voice was steady as the moment hung, suspended in the air. This was never about me. This was about who gets to decide what truth is. Today, that power starts returning to the people. One by one, justices rose, not to object, not to intervene, but because they understood history was happening in front of them, and none of them could stop it now. The courtroom, once a fortress of order and restraint, now felt like a theater in slow collapse. Yet even amid the chaos, there was no shouting, no protests, just the quiet, unsettling hum of realization. Something historic had just happened. The Chief Justice of the United States stood motionless behind the bench, his robe now rumpled, his stature diminished. His voice, once the final word in legal authority, had gone silent. Not because of procedure, but because he had nothing left to say. One of the FBI agents stepped forward and extended a small, sealed envelope. "Justice Roberts," the agent said, voice steady but unmistakably final. "You are now under federal investigation for judicial misconduct, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to subvert constitutional protections." Roberts didn't move. The courtroom held its breath. Karoline Leavitt, still standing near the podium, didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply watched, as the man who had once called her naive, who dismissed her as a mouthpiece, now faced a reckoning he never believed possible. Another clerk approached the agents. This one older, visibly shaken, carrying a narrow brown box filled with handwritten notes, flash drives, and printed communications. These were from his chambers, the clerk said, eyes lowered. He kept everything off-network. We didn't know how much until today. The FBI nodded, accepting the box. Roberts finally spoke, but not to the agents. He turned to Karoline, voice hollow, his pride barely holding. "You don't understand what you've done," he said, a weak tremor behind the words. "You've opened a door that can't be closed. There are others, more than you know." Karoline's response was cold, deliberate. "Then I guess we'll have to walk through every one of them." She stepped aside as the agents approached the bench. Roberts resisted at first, his arms stiff, his steps slow, but eventually he descended from the bench like a man walking off the edge of his empire. Gasps rippled through the room as the metal click of handcuffs echoed like thunder. Phones were up. Cameras flashed. The man who had defined American law for nearly 2 decades was now escorted through the Supreme Court aisle in chains. A woman near the back of the gallery whispered, "No one's untouchable anymore." Outside the courthouse, news had already broken. Protesters cheered. Reporters scrambled. A hashtag began trending within minutes. Hashtag Roberts resigns. Another followed almost immediately. Hashtag Leavitt for justice. The crowd outside roared as Roberts was led through the side exit into a black government vehicle. The doors slammed shut with finality. Inside the courtroom, the shock had turned to a kind of awe, quiet, raw, and irreversible. One of the remaining justices stood, Justice Barrett, her face unreadable, and walked over to Karoline. "You came in here unarmed by title, but you brought more truth than half this court in a decade." Karoline gave a faint nod. The truth didn't need a title. It needed a witness. Moments later, the lead FBI agent returned to the well of the court, documents in hand. He looked around the room and then directly at Karoline. "We found something else." He held up a document, plain, typed, stamped. 7 additional judges. Same donor patterns. Same civic influence. Same secret accounts. This isn't just about Roberts. It's a network. Karoline's eyes narrowed as she reached for the page. "Then we expose the network." The agent gave a slow nod. "We'd like you as a witness. For the full investigation." She didn't hesitate. "I'm in." As the courtroom emptied, the press gathered outside, surged toward the doors. Microphones. Questions. Flashes. One shouted above the rest. "Karoline, do you have anything to say to the American people?" She stopped just before stepping outside, turned to face the camera, looked dead into the lens. today proved no one is above the law, not even the ones writing it. They silenced voices. They twisted rulings. But the truth still found its way through. And if they think this ends here, they're wrong. We just got started. The clip would go viral within hours. Shared by conservatives, independents, even stunned moderates. Millions would see it. Tens of thousands would comment. But the most common phrase? She did what no one else could. Back at home later that night, Karoline stood over her desk, reviewing the next wave of documents. Names, dates, bank trails. The list from the FBI had become her roadmap. Her phone buzzed again. X notifications nonstop. Hashtag Leavitt leaks. Hashtag Justice for all. A new one. Hashtag the Roberts Files. She looked out her window at the Capitol dome lit up against the night sky. They said she didn't belong in that courtroom. They were right. She didn't belong under their rules. She came to rewrite them.